June 7th, 1981. Israel destroys Iraq's nuclear reactor in 120 seconds. But the real operation took 8 years. And it started with a dead scientist in a Paris hotel. This is the story of how Mossad stole Saddam's nuclear secrets before the world even knew they existed. The chain begins 8 years earlier. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel vowed never again to let an enemy change the balance of power in secret. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein drew the opposite lesson. Iraq in the mid-70s was awash with oil money and paranoia. Baghdad glittered with new highways and palaces, but power still rested on fear. Saddam read every intelligence brief like a personal insult. He told ministers that Egypt had lost because it lacked the weapon that ends all arguments. He saw nuclear power not as science, but as immortality, a monument to outlive him. Every scientist he recruited swore loyalty on the Quran. Every engineer worked under portrait eyes, the size of banners. The reactor wasn't just about deterrence. It was about legacy carved in uranium. He wanted Iraq to dominate the Arab world, and a nuclear program would give him that status. Publicly, he spoke of peaceful energy. Privately, he told aides to buy technology that could, if needed, make a bomb. In 1976, Iraq signed a deal with France for a 40-megawatt Osirak-type reactor, soon called Tammuz or Osirak, plus training, fuel, and technicians. On paper, the project sat under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. In reality, safeguards work only as long as inspectors are welcome. The contract was worth $300 million, nearly $1.5 billion in today's money. For context, that was 8% of Iraq's entire annual budget. Within weeks of the French deal, Mossad placed agents inside Technikatomi's Paris headquarters. One posed as a janitor for 11 months, photographing blueprints after midnight. Another seduced a shipping clerk in Marseille, copying manifests that revealed every component bound for Baghdad. By early 1977, Israeli intelligence had complete reactor schematics before Iraq's own engineers received them. In Tel Aviv, analysts concluded that with French fuel and some reprocessing, Iraq could reach weapon-grade material within a few years. When Menachem Begin became prime minister, he made the file a priority. The doctrine was simple: no hostile neighbor would ever be allowed to get the bomb. Mossad began mapping the French supply chain. The key contractors, Technikatomi, Air Liquide, CNIM, were all clustered along the Mediterranean. Agents under commercial cover rented apartments near ports, tracked shipments, copied invoices. The mission: delay the project long enough to find a permanent solution. Inside Mossad, opinion split. Younger officers wanted sabotage now. Veterans warned that panic could expose their network in France. A memo from the operations chief read, "If we strike too early, we teach them to hide better." For months, the argument played out in smoke-filled rooms, analysts pinning maps of Marseille and Lyon, while accountants calculated how long Iraq could fund the reactor. In the end, they chose patience, the slow bleed of bureaucracy over the flash of dynamite. That decision would save the mission later, but it nearly tore the service apart. In April 1979, an explosion tore through a warehouse at La Seine-sur-Mer, destroying reactor parts bound for Iraq. No casualties, no claim of responsibility. Exactly Mossad's style. The blast destroyed $14 million in reactor components, equivalent to $58 million today. In a windowless room beneath Tel Aviv, Mossad officers listened to the radio traffic from France, insurance calls, coded telexes, silence. Every explosion abroad echoed in that basement like a heartbeat. One handler muttered, "Every delay costs someone their life." The chief didn't reply. He simply drew a line through a name on the board and lit another cigarette. In this war, success wasn't measured in medals, but in minutes gained. French insurers immediately tripled premiums on Iraq-bound shipments, adding another $6 million to the program's cost. 3 weeks later, a French nuclear engineer's car wouldn't start. Bomb squad found plastic explosive wired to the ignition, but no fingerprints, no witnesses. The engineer quit the Osirak project the next day. 2 more contractors followed within a month, Insurance premiums on Iraq-bound shipments tripled. Fear became a weapon. The sabotage pushed back delivery by months and sowed paranoia among suppliers. Every delay gave Israel more time. Yahya el-Mossad was brilliant, discreet, and doomed. An Egyptian physicist exiled for criticizing Cairo's surrender to Washington, he became the keystone of Iraq's program, the living link between Baghdad's ambition and France's technology. He lived alone in Paris's Hôtel Le Méridien, spending nights annotating reactor manuals and dictating reports in 2 languages. Mossad surveilled him for 9 months, photographing visitors, timing his routines, noting which cafe waiter he trusted. When agents learned he was finalizing a shipment of enriched uranium fuel assemblies, a decision came down from Tel Aviv. Neutralize the brain, delay the body. 3 days later, he was found dead, throat cut with surgical precision. French police called it a crime of passion. The press called it coincidence. Intelligence officers called it confirmation that Mossad's invisible war had begun. Within 72 hours, 2 more Iraqi nuclear scientists canceled their European trips, one citing a family emergency, the other simply vanishing from his hotel in Rome. His luggage was found intact, passport gone. Interpol opened a missing persons case that quietly closed 3 weeks later. Inside Iraq's Atomic Energy Commission, fear replaced ambition. The corridors that once buzzed with talk of progress now echoed with whispers. One physicist started sleeping in his office with a pistol under his desk. Another burned his notes before going home, terrified they'd mark him as next. Every knock at the door felt like a verdict. The reactor wasn't delayed by technology. It was delayed by terror. The message was clear. Work on Osirak, and you become a target. Inside the Baghdad Research Center, the silence was unbearable. Scientists began sleeping in shifts, locking lab doors from the inside. One physicist later told interrogators he'd stopped taking his briefcase home, afraid Mossad might wire it to explode. For the men building Iraq's reactor, the question was no longer how to enrich uranium, but whether they'd live long enough to finish. The tempo of Iraq's program slowed. Then, unexpectedly, Iran attacked. In September 1980, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian F-4s bombed the Osirak site. Damage was minor, but reconnaissance photos revealed the exact layout of the complex. Those images, shared quietly through Western channels, reached Israel. For the first time, the target was mapped in full. In a dim operations room, analysts pinned the photos across a corkboard, black and white satellite frames from the Iranian strike. One showed the dome half-shattered, scaffolding still visible. A technician circled the crater with a red grease pencil and whispered, "They built it exactly like the French manuals." The room fell silent. For years they'd imagined the target. Now it stared back at them in perfect geometry. Someone said, "The Iranians did our reconnaissance for us." No one cheered. They all knew what came next. Proof, justification, and then silence. But having the blueprints wasn't enough. Mossad needed proof of weapons intent, the smoking gun that would justify a preemptive strike to the world. That evidence came from a stolen letter. In October 1980, an Iraqi procurement officer in Brussels left his briefcase unattended in a cafe for 6 minutes. When he returned, everything looked untouched. But Mossad had photographed every page. Inside, orders for vacuum pumps and high-speed cameras, equipment that made sense only for a nuclear weapons program. Begin saw the photos and told his cabinet, "If we do not act, they will." But Iran's strike revealed something else. Iraq's air defenses were weak. The reactor sat exposed, protected only by outdated Soviet radar and a handful of anti-aircraft guns. Mossad analysts realized the Iranians had done the reconnaissance work for them. Now Israel had both the blueprints and proof the site was vulnerable. The decision was made. That night, Begin sat with his ministers under harsh fluorescent light. One warned, "Washington will call it aggression." Another muttered, "Paris will turn." Begin didn't raise his voice. "History will not wait for permission," he said. The room went quiet. Outside, the rain beat against the windows like distant artillery. When the meeting ended, no one looked him in the eye. They all understood the cost. At Nevatim Air Base, young pilots practiced the route on simulators built from plywood and paper maps. They flew 6 feet above desert sand until their knuckles bled from the control stick. Each night they gathered in silence, replaying radar profiles and fuel equations. One instructor wrote in his diary, "We trained to miss death by inches." Every rehearsal ended the same way, a blackout of lights, the sound of wind, and the commander's voice. "Remember, the world will hate us first and thank us later." In early 1981, the Air Force rehearsed. 8 F-16s and 6 F-15s would fly 600 kilometers across Jordan and Saudi Arabia, drop 2-ton bombs, and return home without refueling. Every detail of the flight depended on intelligence gathered by Mossad. Dome height, wall thickness, the timing of guard rotations. Strike before the fuel rods arrived and fallout would be political. Strike after, and it could be radioactive. The window was closing. French technicians were scheduled to begin hot testing within weeks. Once the reactor went critical, any strike would scatter radioactive material across Baghdad, killing thousands. If Israel waited, it was catastrophe. If they struck too early, Iraq could simply rebuild. The margin for error was zero. On June 7, 1981, the jets lifted off from southern Israel. They flew low over the Red Sea, silent and invisible to radar. As they entered Iraqi airspace, the lead pilot radioed one word: attack. 2 minutes later, the Osirak reactor was gone. Iraqi air defense never fired a shot. By the time radar operators understood what was happening, the F-16s were already over Jordan, flying low through the desert haze. One pilot later said the hardest part wasn't the bombing. It was the silence on the way home, wondering if the world would condemn them or thank them. All planes returned safely. The airstrike cost Israel $14 million to execute. Saddam's reactor program had consumed $400 million. In 120 seconds, Israel erased a decade of investment. The world erupted. The UN condemned Israel. Washington froze new jet deliveries. Paris cut ties. Begin's reply was cold logic. Condemnations pass, nuclear weapons do not. Inside Israeli intelligence, the mood was quiet triumph. Years of covert work had delivered a perfect operation. Without the sabotage, assassinations, and stolen data, the pilots would have flown blind. In Baghdad, the mood was chaos. Saddam convened his generals in a bunker, demanding to know how Israel had learned every detail. He ordered arrests and interrogations, convinced there had been spies inside the program. In truth, the leaks had come from Europe, from briefcases copied in hotel rooms, from conversations overheard in cafes. Information, not infiltration, had undone him. Mossad's task now shifted from sabotage to surveillance. Officers in Europe monitored front companies trying to buy precision tools, vacuum pumps, bearings, aluminum tubing, the raw material of enrichment. Each suspicious order triggered quiet pressure on local authorities. Some shipments were blocked outright, others simply got lost. By 1982, Iraq's nuclear effort existed mostly on paper. In a Tel Aviv basement, the Mossad debrief stretched for 46 hours. Pilots spoke in monosyllables. Analysts corrected maps in red ink. Technicians cataloged debris photographs like coroners at a crime scene. No medals, no parades, only the soft scrape of typewriters documenting a war that officially never happened. One handler asked, "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" The chief replied, "If they rebuild, we'll remind them why they shouldn't." Outside, the city slept, unaware that history had just been rewritten in invisible ink. For nearly a decade, that paper war continued, bureaucrats signing contracts for parts that would never arrive, scientists sketching reactors that would never be built. Still, Israel didn't relax. In the mid-1980s, as the Iran-Iraq war consumed the region, analysts watched for signs that Saddam might rebuild. They tracked engineers, watched embassies, read trade journals. Whenever an Iraqi buyer showed sudden interest in dual-use equipment, A phone call from Tel Aviv would alert customs somewhere in Europe. Most of the time, that was enough. When the Gulf War erupted in 1991, coalition forces discovered what remained of Iraq's program: scattered labs, incomplete enrichment equipment, no assembled weapon. But Saddam had learned one lesson from Osirak: never put all your secrets in one place. By 1991, Iraq was running 4 separate nuclear programs, each hidden, each compartmentalized. Coalition inspectors spent years hunting them down. They found centrifuge parts buried in rose gardens, blueprints hidden in irrigation pipes, and uranium compounds stored in children's schools. Mossad's intelligence had crippled the main program, but Saddam had built backups. The question became, how many more secrets were still hidden? A decade of attrition had worked. Inspectors later concluded that Iraq was far from producing a bomb. Inside Mossad, veterans of the Osirak campaign saw confirmation that their long game, steal the secrets, delay the clock, had succeeded. But the cost was invisible. Mossad never released casualty figures from the sabotage campaign. French intelligence suspected at least 6 deaths beyond El Mossad: contractors, engineers, middlemen. None were officially connected to Israel. The operations remained so classified that even some Israeli cabinet members learned details only decades later.
The legacy of that doctrine reached far beyond Iraq. For Israel, Osirak became both model and warning. Any future threat would be judged by the same principle: act before it's too late. When intelligence in the 2000s pointed to secret Iranian enrichment, the parallels were unmistakable. Foreign contracts, hidden facilities, public claims of peaceful intent. The agency that had once shadowed French engineers now monitored cargo flights to Natanz. The parallels were exact. In 2010, the Stuxnet virus destroyed Iranian centrifuges, digital sabotage instead of explosives, but the same doctrine. Between 2010 and 2012, 5 Iranian scientists died in car bombings and motorcycle attacks, echoes of El Mossad in Paris. In 2018, nearly 4 decades after Osirak, Mossad operatives broke into a warehouse in Tehran and removed hundreds of kilograms of secret files, proof of Iran's secret nuclear studies. The world was stunned not just by what was taken, but by how it was done. Months of surveillance, precision timing, extraction without casualties. Different country, same method. 40 years later, Mossad was still stealing nuclear secrets. Only the technology had changed. Destroy secrecy. Cripple capability. The continuity was deliberate. Inside Mossad, officers still quoted a line first spoken after the 1981 raid. A reactor can be rebuilt. A secret cannot. The principle shaped every operation that followed. Intelligence isn't only about discovering plans. It's about denying an adversary the illusion of privacy. Looking back, the campaign against Saddam's program wasn't a single strike or theft. It was a chain of precise, quiet actions, each one shaving months off Iraq's schedule until there was nothing left to shave. The explosion in France, the death in Paris, the stolen letters, the diplomatic warnings, and finally the airstrike were all pieces of one mosaic: preemptive defense through information. 4 decades later, intelligence officers still quote the Osirak playbook. Every satellite feed, every cyber breach, every anonymous leak owes its DNA to that mission. It proved that information could substitute for invasion, that a spreadsheet could destroy faster than a missile. In war colleges, cadets study the begin doctrine as both deterrent and warning. The question they ask isn't whether Israel was right. It's whether any nation, given the same intelligence, would have done differently. From orbit today, Osirak looks like a scar that refuses to heal, half swallowed by desert, half preserved by memory. The crater glows pale under moonlight, wind carving faint lines where concrete once stood. Locals say nothing grows there, not even weeds. The silence isn't emptiness, it's history exhaling. What began with blueprints and whispers ended here, in a void so complete it could be mistaken for peace. Today, the Osirak site lies in ruins, half buried in sand. But the doctrine forged there lives on. Every suspicious shipment, every scientist who changes travel patterns, Every reactor deal is watched through the same lens. Act early, act precisely, leave no trace. The lesson of Osirak isn't just about stopping one bomb. It's about what intelligence can do when used as a weapon. Mossad didn't invade Iraq. They didn't need to. They stole Saddam's secrets, killed his experts, and destroyed his equipment, one piece at a time across 8 years in 12 countries. By the time the F-16S crossed the desert, the war was already won. The airstrike was just the world finding out. This is how Mossad stole Saddam's nuclear secrets, not by breaking into Baghdad bunkers, but by dismantling his invisibility. The war was fought with dossiers, cameras, and silence, long before the bombs fell. And when the next race for the bomb begins, and it always does, those who remember 1981 will recognize the pattern instantly. This is how wars are won before they're fought. Israel thought eliminating Saddam's nuclear dream would buy decades of safety. It didn't. Because the moment one threat vanished, another boarded a train to Rome. A Hamas commander, a European passenger train, and a Mossad operation so silent that even the people sitting beside him never realized he'd been hunted. This wasn't an airstrike or a covert bomb. It was precision. On wheels. If you think the Osirak mission was daring, wait until you see what Mossad did inside a moving train. Next episode, how Mossad hunted a Hamas commander aboard a train to Rome. The Shadow War didn't end with Osirak. It just changed tracks. Subscribe, because the next story hits even harder. This is Brinkwell. I will see you in the next one.